Welcome to Keiser Voices, the story of success, brought to you by Keiser University Graduate School, here where the academic world meets personal triumph. Join us today as we dive into the captivating tales of success.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Keiser Voices. And today we're going to be taking another dive into hot topics in the criminal justice industry by talking with our special guest today, Dr. Alex Toth, who is one of our professors here at the graduate school. He's a criminologist and he teaches our criminal justice programs, criminology, and homeland security. But we're going to be talking about extremism. What is it and how is it related to terrorism? So thank you so much, Dr. Alex, for joining us today.
No, thank you very much, Heather, for having me. I appreciate it.
So I think this is a very relevant conversation to be having. I don't think people understand what's a belief, what's extreme, and how does it take us all the way to terrorism, which unfortunately I think is in all of our vocabularies these days. So I think it's important to start off with what's extremism.
Yeah, sure. So before I get into that, I just want to say, my interest in researching extremism, in teaching about it and terrorism really goes back to my time as my 25 and a half years that I spent as a U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration Special Agent. You may be thinking, oh, well, how in the world does being a DEA, a drug agent, translate into an interest into terrorism and extremism? Well, here's the thing. What many people don't understand is that terrorism in particular, and there is a difference between extremism and terrorism. Terrorism, more often than not, especially if it is international in scope, and there's difference between terrorist types, domestic and international, which I'll talk about. But the bottom line is, if it's international in scope, terrorism, oftentimes it is funded by transnational crime that goes from one country to another. And of course, drugs are involved in that. So I spent the latter part of my career working in charge of the majority of South America. And so we dealt with these terrorist groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah and this sort of thing down in South America, believe it or not, who were utilizing drug trafficking and money laundering activities down there to fund their activities. So that was part of my interest in the topic. And then most importantly, I guess, is that the largest domestic terrorism attack that ever happened in the United States was the Oklahoma City bombing. Timothy McVeigh blew up the Arthur Murrah building, right? The federal building there, killed numerous children. One of the other people that he killed in that attack was one of my DEA classmates, Ken McCullough, who left a family behind. And, we went to the academy together, and he was killed by Timothy McVeigh, a domestic terrorist and somebody who had become radicalized through extremist beliefs. So anyways, going back to extremism and terrorism, there is a difference. Let's talk first of all about extremism, okay? So extremism is exactly what it sounds like. It's a belief that goes beyond mainstream belief or beyond any sort of a balance, right? When something's extreme, it's out of balance. And that's what we deal with extremism. And extremism is founded upon ideologies. And an ideology is, in fact, a set of beliefs that we all have. We all have ideologies. And our ideologies generally focus among the three types of extremism. We have ideologies or thoughts or beliefs religiously. We have thoughts or beliefs, right? Ideologies economically. We do. And we generally have them politically and then socially, right? And the political and social tend to go hand in hand. So those are actually the four. So that's the whole thing. When somebody, one of their ideologies or thought processes take or become extreme, either to this spectrum of to the left or to the right, we call that extremists, an extremist ideology. And that's different than terrorism.
Does extremism always have a negative connotation to them? Because I feel like at least in my lifetime,
Mhm.
I could tell you exactly where I was on September 11th.
Sure.
I was in high school. I was in the library. So I think maybe for my generation more so, like we associate the word extremism with this negative, like with September 11th attacks, like you automatically want to go to the negative. But is that always the case? Is it always negative?
Well, no, I mean, I think, I mean, balance is always best, right? But there are
Mhm.
some things, think about it, when you want to be extreme. If you are, for example, a graduate school student or even an undergraduate school student, and you hit finals week or you have papers due, you want to be extreme in your focus to get that done. So this word extremism, as I was mentioning, really focuses on ideologies, but that's different than terrorism. Terrorism is when, if you will, extremism becomes malignant. Okay, the beliefs become malignant in that they bleed over into violent behavior, right? And there's different definitions of terrorism. The one I like best comes from Hess and colleagues from 2017, and it says this is what terrorism is. It is the use or the threat of the use of violence against non-combatants to bring about social, political, or religious change. So it's important, right? Somebody could go in and as horrible as it may be and do a mass shooting, and it may not be an act of terrorism. It's only an act of terrorism if that person, the motivation was to what? Bring about social, political, or religious change. So I think that's important to understand that definition. But that whole idea of terrorism, though, does begin with extremism. And extremism of an ideology, socially, politically, or religiously. And when you look at it, so let's think about for a minute the spectrum of beliefs that we have. You have in the middle, right, which is being a balanced approach. Then you will have slightly left, more liberal, little bit more left, right? And you would say, okay, liberal. And then you could be extremely liberal, but then you could be extremist or radical liberal. And the same holds true for conservative viewpoints politically, religiously, and socially. You could be kind of in the middle and maybe a little bit right, maybe more right, maybe I'm wholly right, all the way to extreme radicalized right. When you hit those fringe groups, that's when you tend to get in trouble.
So, in your research and even as your experience as a DA officer, what is it that drives somebody to cross that line from having, strong beliefs into embracing extremist or radical views?
Yeah, so it's a great question. When you look at how people end up in this sort of situation, you have to think of two words: disenfranchisement and inequality. Okay,
Okay.
let's break them down. Disenfranchisement in general means what? Somebody doesn't have a voice. You don't have a voice. You don't think you're heard, right? Nobody likes that. As shocking as it may be, as you look at me, and I'm a little bit older, maybe a lot older. But with that said, shockingly, I have a 22-month-old child at home, and my child, unplanned, unexpected. But with that said, and she may be extreme at times. With that said, I don't think she's a full-blown terrorist, but she may be on the verge. But my point is this: if you want to see her get upset, let her not think she's being heard. And
Mhm.
she will go crazy. She'll start screaming. She'll do anything she can to get attention. We're no different. All of us want to be heard. We want to think we're heard. We want to think that our voice matters. So that's one thing. People that feel they are disenfranchised, either religiously, their religious beliefs are not necessarily heard or understood or accepted. Politically, they may feel that way. Socially, with whatever stance they have, they feel disenfranchised. Next, the feeling of inequality. And inequality comes in really two different forms, right? Inequality of outcomes, how we feel we measure up with our outcomes, maybe financially, socially, politically. Do we feel that the outcomes that we believe, the ideologies that fund those things, do we believe that that's an equal type approach? Okay, so inequality of outcomes. If we think it's not, it's problematic. And then secondly, and maybe most importantly, is this feeling of inequality relative to opportunity. If you feel that you don't have an equal opportunity socially, politically, religiously, if you take that disenfranchisement and then you take that inequality, you mix it together, and you have a cocktail mix, if you will, that is deadly and lays a groundwork where somebody can become influenced by people with nefarious plans behind them to lead them down a road of extremism or even terrorism.
So when we look at the extremists who are looking to, I don't want to say justify their violence, but they're, we've gone past these strong feelings and we are talking about violence at this point. How is it that they're able to build their loyalty? I mean, there are large groups of what we have termed extremists, what we have termed radicals and terrorists. I mean, we call them terror cells. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do they get there that they're all around this one belief or cause?
Sure. So here's the thing. We all want to be loved. We all want to be accepted. So you take individuals who are disenfranchised, who feel they have no opportunity, right? There's this feeling of inequality. And all of a sudden, they feel like nobody's listening to them. Nobody gives them an opportunity. And these groups are out there that say, hey, we love you. We accept you. Be part of us. We feel the same way you do. We're us. It's us. And this is key. If you think of it along an acronym of PATH, the PATH, there's all of a sudden this idea of polarization that takes place where it's us, this extremist group, versus them. There's no longer a we. It's us versus them. Step number one. Step number two, this absolutist view, A, in the PATH, right? Mm-hmm. This idea that we are right. We're the only ones that are right, and everybody else is wrong. Number three, this idea of a threat, that the them are threatening our very existence because of what we believe, the ideologies that we hold, right? And so, oh no, now there's this, I'm loved by this group. It's us against them. There's this whole idea of we're the only ones with the right ideas, the right viewpoints. And now, oh my goodness, there's a threat. There's this threat that has to take place. And guess what? I hate the other group. I hate them because they're trying to attack me. And when I hate them, I can disengage morally from what I think is true or right relative to causing harm or pain to others. And all of a sudden, I'm capable of doing that. It's a whole thing called PATH, if you will.
Trying to think where I want to go with my next question for you. The internet, we've been talking a lot about social media. We talked about it on a previous episode of the podcast with Dr. Vecchi and looking at active shooter situations. But I think it's a great question for you too. How is social media playing into this? I know we've heard stories that, this kid, they did it because they were able to connect with these people online, and that's why they're now doing these acts. I believe that was more recently what they were saying about the attack in New Orleans just a few months ago. The person who carried out the acts of terrorism, he connected digitally. So I guess where I'm going is that, has this digital world made it easier to become radicalized, whether you realize it or not, like whether you're seeking it out or just a buildup over time, or was it always there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you know, I tell my students this all the time. There's always, with anything that happens in life, generally there's unintended consequences, right? So we would agree, I think, overall that the internet is a wonderful thing. Interconnectivity is a wonderful thing. Certainly, you and I are not in the same place physically right now, and we're able to connect, and people will see this podcast, hopefully, and that sort of thing. So it's great, but there's unintended consequences. And I think the unintended consequences that occur are, first of all, the anonymity that can occur with internet and connectivity, right, through cyberspace. That's one. And then number two, this idea that we stop engaging in face-to-face communications and relationships, and then that opens the door again for people who feel marginalized, disenfranchised, they have no opportunity. They turn to the internet. And here's the thing, it's not just social media. What we know is that when it comes to extremism and when it comes to terrorism, these groups will even use games to bring in people and to start interacting with them. And they build a relationship and they start to slowly groom the person and win the person over. And again, if you feel like you are an island, you're all alone, and all of a sudden, whoa, I found other people on the island. I'm not alone, right? You saw that movie, I can't remember it, with Tom Hanks, but all he had was the volleyball, right? Wilson was his only buddy. Imagine if it was Castaway. Imagine if Tom Hanks, rather, would have been on the island and found a whole group of other people there and said, whoa, we're all together. And that's what happens. Couple that's what's happening on mainstream connectivity. But then when you hit the dark web, that's a whole different thing. That's when things get really serious and really nefarious, if you will, for lack of a better word, as far as what goes on. And many terrorist and extremist groups operate widespread on the dark web, as do other transnational crime groups, right? Very difficult to track down.
How can we fight that? How do we fight terrorism efforts? Knowing that sometimes it does backfire and can deepen the feelings towards it.
Yeah. So I think number one is, and this is going to sound somewhat cliche, but I do believe that as individuals, and it can start as an individual, right? Change really begins with us and us alone. Any change happens in the world begins with one person at a time. So I don't mean to be cliche when I say it begins with us in being more open and accepting of people and of individuals across the board, and realizing, hey, you know what? No one really has all the answers on anything. If that person did, if any of us did, we would be a bazillionaire. On every piece of money we have in this country, it says what? In Latin, e pluribus union. Union. Out of one, right, comes many, right? That's this whole idea that there's many different views. It's the United States of America. I'm talking predominantly right now about Americans, but it's the United States of America. We have these different states. They're all different. We have different people. So it begins there, number one. Number two, being aware and taking the time to pay attention to your friends and the people you interact with. Do you see them feeling isolated? Are they verbalizing extreme positions or ideas? And if so, being able to engage with them and have a civil conversation. Are they starting to go towards that us against them mentality? All of a sudden, are they cutting off from social contact, reaching out at that point to these people? That's where I believe it begins. And it begins, building that sort of community with one another.
That also have a negative effect on.
Well, I think it becomes, look, what fuels an us versus them mentality is when we respond to these people and immediately shut them down. We fuel that idea of you're absolutely wrong, right? If I were to say to you about any conversation we had, you know what, Heather, you're just wrong. Can't tell you why you're wrong, but you're crazy. Do you even think that way? You're out of your mind. You're lost. Even uglier things. You're stupid. How can you think that way?
Mm-hmm.
You do that, what happens? It fuels that idea of, whoa, you would be saying, are them. And I need to be with my us people. And wow, you seem like you're a threat to me. Right? So I think in that regard, if you respond that way, then that can have a negative impact. You cannot fuel that idea. You have to be willing, again, to say, hey, you can have those views. May not like them. I may think they're wrong. But you know what? Let's talk. Let's understand that you have that right. But if you take away the us versus them mentality, then hopefully you can then start to bring people back in. But the last thing you want to do is fuel that idea.
And that makes sense. And I kind of want to go back to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, because I don't want to not bring it up, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or even myths about who can be an extremist and who can be a terrorist. One of the things you mentioned, you told us, and I'm sorry to hear about your friend who was in the bombings with Timothy McVeigh, but you called him you called him a domestic terrorist. And I think more often than not, and maybe it's just, again, I have vague memories of Timothy McVeigh, but I can tell you about September 11th. So there's such a thing as a domestic terrorist. So they're not foreign made when it comes to extremists or terrorists, is really what my question is.
Yeah, absolutely. So real quick. Domestic, international terrorism, there is a difference. Those are two terms, okay? So let's just quickly break it down. Domestic terrorism is terrorism that happens within a country by citizens of that country against individuals in that country, okay? Everything is in that country and it's perpetrated by citizens of that country. In the case of Timothy McVeigh, not only was he a citizen of the United States, right, but he was a veteran of the 1st Infantry Division in the United States Army, right? He was a war veteran. And in the very strange connection is when I was in the Army, I was actually in the 1st Infantry Division. We lived in the same area. It's crazy, right, when you think of that. But with that said, when you look at international terrorism is when the attack is taken out or made by individuals who are citizens of another country against individuals who are citizens of a country other than their own, right? Or in a location that is outside of their physical country. But there's those two main types of terrorism. Sometimes they overlap and they bleed into one another, but generally we can turn around and see that distinction. When we look at threats of terrorism and acts of terrorism in the United States today, by far the greatest threat is domestic terrorism, either extreme left groups or extreme right groups that are perpetrating it, or extreme left or right ideologies.
So then my final question then is for you. I wanted to go back to that to bring up the domestic terrorism. What practical steps can students or communities take to challenge these extremist narratives before they spread? Not necessarily feeding into the fire, but putting the fire out before we even get there.
Yeah. I think again is paying attention to the people that you come in contact with, and speaking out when you see or you hear of extremist groups, not saying, hey, that's okay. It's not saying, oh, it's okay if you use violent rhetoric or terms or words. That's not okay. It's not okay to do that. And taking that stance and being willing to say, look, I am not okay with this. Because the minute you say, yeah, or you turn your cheek the other way, or you just ignore it, that's when things can fester and get out of control. Because words matter. What people say matters. We all know that. And if it progresses beyond words, right, that's when we get in trouble and go, oh, I never saw that coming. Well, really, when you look back, this person was posting all this stuff. Maybe somebody should have said, whoa, you got a problem.
And it's so interesting, this conversation with you. I mentioned we had the conversation with Dr. Vecchi, and even looking back into May when we talked about Mental Health Month, the underlining part of all of these conversations that strangely you would think these two topics don't tie together is just listening to what somebody else is saying. They're saying, I'm not okay. They're saying, I'm feeling violent. I'm not feeling heard. I mean, it's amazing what I always tell I have a 7-year-old, soon to be 8. I tell them, turn your listening ears on. But maybe we should be telling that to each other. Turn your listening ears on. Because if you were to listen, there's so much for you to hear.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Life is complicated today, right? It's always been complicated to certain times, but it's complicated, and it's easy to get caught up within ourselves and to lose the connectivity of being human. Being human matters. We all have the same shared experiences. They may be different, and they may be with different contexts, within different contextual backgrounds, but we're all human. And we need sometimes, I think, to take a step back and go, hey, I want to connect with you. I want to understand you. And, oh, what you're saying is wrong. Hey, where are you going with this? That matters. That matters. But I think those things can certainly go a long way. I would say this, look, the idea of extremism and terrorism is not new. It goes all the way back to around 1000, or at the very, the 1000 AD, with Sicarii zealots. And they were people who felt unheard, right? No opportunity. They felt like they were not listened to, and they acted out and committed acts of terrorism back in Jerusalem. So it's a common thread throughout all of mankind for a long, long time.
Well, Dr. Alex, I can't thank you enough for connecting with us and having this conversation and really shedding some light on extremism and terrorism. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
No, really enjoyed it. And hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Okay.
Thank you. And if you all have enjoyed this conversation, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and follow, and continue listening the month of June as we take a deep dive into some hot topics in the criminal justice industry. And we will catch you on the next one.
Thank you for journeying with us today on Keiser Voices, the story of success. As we close this chapter, remember, every story has its next page.